Condemnations abroad, celebration in country. Mixed reactions trail Gabon military takeover. Is the worst democracy better than the best military regime? Also on the program, we take a look at highlights from the Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi, Kenya. This is Africa Update on Trust TV, reaching you from Abuja, Nigeria's capital. I am Ayuba Ilya. Thanks for joining. Mixed reactions have trailed the recent military takeover in Gabon. While the international community condemned the coup, including the suspension of the country from African Union and the sub-regional bloc economic community of Central African states. For the Gabonese, it is liberation, having been under the rulership of the Bongos for over 5 decades. In its editorial on 3rd of September 2023, titled "Politicians Must Save Democracy in Africa," Daily Trust Sunday newspaper wrote, quote, "Democracy, in other words, has simply refused to take hold here, but it is not because Africans do not want democracy." While it condemns military coups in whatever shape or form, it notes that African politicians have failed democracy in Africa and are almost wholly responsible for the reversal of democratic gains. Now, with the argument over the justification of the military coup raiding over the air, we interrogate the old narrative that the worst democracy is better than the best military regime. To discuss this further, we have Adagbo Onoja, an academic and expert of international relations, to give us perspectives on this. Thank you so much for joining us on Africa Update today, Mr. Onoja.
Thank you, Mr. Ayuba.
All right. Well, let's start with your reactions with the recent spate of coups on the African continent. We've had Mali, since 2020, we are now talking about 8 coups on the continent.
Well, I think it has taken everybody by surprise in terms of the consistency of the coup from one country to another, and then the number that's involved in the last 3 or 4 years. Because the assumption is that military rule has become an aberration, and we are done with military rule. We are in favor of democracy. That's the belief. So it came as a surprise to many people. But if you look carefully, it should not be that surprising. My argument in that regard is that every time there is a change in global power configuration, you have new ways of doing things emerging from unanticipated quarters. And one of the things that is emerging is this phenomenon of coups, phenomenon of return to coups. And it is happening not because the military is a coherent group, as we used to know, not because the military is necessarily an instrument of imperialist conveyor belt, as we also used to know. It's simply because there are new openings, new understanding of things, new dynamics, new sources of technology that are playing out. Unlike before, when the Western world defined everything, the Western world, led by the United States, decides what is right, what is wrong, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. And they've decided who became what across the world. That has changed because there are new actors on the power table, on the global power table. These new actors, whether you call them countries or interest groups, have the same capabilities that the West used to provide. So you find that in the case of the coups, you find that most of the military officers that are staging the coup, they have not only gone to Western military academies, they have also gone to other military academies. So they have a new network, new set of network, new backers, new technologies, new conceptual analysis, new methods of doing things. And that's why this is happening. So in other words, it shouldn't be too surprising, because every time you have a change of power relations at the global level, many things change. Every time you have a change of power relations at the global level, many things change. What used to be normal from 1945 to the present day are no longer automatically normal. That's the way to understand it. In other words, power is the most important variable playing out right now in the understanding of this coup.
Okay, so in this sense then, should we be seeing the kind of celebrations we're seeing on the streets of some of the countries that have been taken over by the military? Many of them consider this, what's going on, as revolutionary. And if we have had this experience before in the past, then can we really say that it's revolutionary, or it's just a repeat of history?
Well, it is a lazy man's work to say it is revolutionary or it's not revolutionary. Revolutions are not defined by what we think about them. Revolutions are product of certain dynamics, certain actors coming together. And the way these actors enact the revolution depends on so many variables, some of which are not even within their control, right? It's one thing for a coup leader to say, this is what we are going to do. It's another thing for them to do exactly that when they really take over power. So the dynamics are not within anybody's control. The man who is nationalist today, who is radical today, can also be captured. Ideologically speaking, Mobutu was captured at a point. He liberated himself, became very Pan-Africanist, became cultural revivalist, and then later he fell into deeper imperialist control. So these things are not stable. They are not fixed. They keep changing. So the coups, anybody who celebrates the coups as revolutionary or not revolutionary is wasting his time. We still need to empower the people to assert themselves over any type of government that we have, whether we call it democracy, autocracy, monarchy, or military rule. It's when the people are able to assert themselves that governments move in a certain direction. So let people not jubilate and call it and say, oh, this coup is anti-imperialist, it's radical, it's nationalist. No, that's not how to go about it. If you go about it that way, you make a mistake. Before you know, you are confronted with something else. Don't forget, these guys who are taking over now have their own basic training. They have their own sentiment. They have their own professional commitments. And they have learned a certain tactics for doing certain things. And the tactics of containing the enemy, managers of violence, I don't know whether it can be inherently radical or inherently conservative. We have to be careful.
Now, there's been this long debate, an old debate about, democracy or military. Some have gone ahead to say, well, the worst democracy is better than the best military regime that you can ever have. Let me have your own thoughts around this.
Yeah, there is something to caution against that, because democracy as a concept has no permanent meaning. It has no universal meaning. Anybody who is parading a universal meaning of democracy is wasting everybody's time. As I mentioned earlier, democracy, the popular definition that everybody seems to know is that democracy is government of the people, by the people, for the people. And the question about that is, were we all people at all times? There was a time we Africans were not regarded as people. There was a time women were not regarded as human beings. Philosophers in the West were debating whether women have souls like men. There was a time slaves were not regarded as people. In other words, from the onset, democracy was not for certain people. So it's not, it's a lazy way of looking at it. Democracy is government of the people, for the people, because it's not all people that were people on the beginning at a certain point. So we need to be careful. And the way to go about it is to say, okay, let people come to an understanding of what democracy means for them. Don't sew a democracy kaftan and give to everybody to wear. That is imperialism. Let people understand what kind of democracy serves them. Is it liberal democracy? Is it village square democracy? Is it representative democracy? If they reach a consensus, if, for example, we in Nigeria reach a consensus and say the best way we want to govern ourselves is through traditional authority, then it should be what we should seek to defend, not what somebody stand somewhere and say this is democracy. Because I should cite an example. In 1985 or so, the Economist of London did a survey on democracy. Now, the Economist of London does not pretend to be radical. But if you read that, it punctured democracy from A to Z. Modern democracy, the Economist of London, which is the Bible or the Holy Quran of globalization. All right? It's the holy book of globalization. But it was saying that democracy is problematic, that people are never the same. And once people vote, then they have to sit aside and watch the people they voted deciding, making all the decisions for 4 years. So democracy has always had serious problems, and we should not take it as defined by people. We should take it as what best serves us. And if we decide that this is what best serves our interest, this is the best way that we will defend our interest in democracy, then that should be our notion of democracy. Then in that case, you can say that the worst form of democracy is preferable to the best form of military rule. Right now, that statement does not make sense because we have not sat down to decide that. And in Nigeria, we need to be careful. The last time we had a debate in this country, nobody voted for liberal democracy. You remember under Babangida, very recently, 1986 or thereabout. It's not up to 50 years. It's this generation. So we shouldn't go about parading what people are writing in newspapers and say democracy is the best form of government. What is the meaning of that?
Okay, so going by this analogy now, and with the kinds of celebrations we've seen in some of these countries that have been taken over by the military, can we then say that if the people are okay by it, then no cause for alarm?
Well, the reason the celebrations on the streets whenever there is a coup should be understood from two perspectives. The first perspective is a sense of relief from the tyranny of so-called democratic rulers. So people are happy that they have been humiliated, they have been sent packing, right? But if you look at it the other way, that tyranny also teaches people, also radicalizes people. The tyrannical attitude of those in power has a tendency to radicalize people. And the cumulative impact of that radicalizing impact is such that at a point, the people will have developed the capacity to discipline the government in power, whether it's a dictatorship or whatever, right? So if you have military coup now, yes, you get immediate relief. You're happy that the tyrants have been humiliated, have been sent packing, but you have also lost something. In other words, so I'm not saying the celebration is good or bad. I'm saying it's a dilemma. It's something we need to be careful about. When a coup occurs, people are happy because the people who are suffering them have been sent packing, okay, have been humiliated, have been dispatched away. But the coup also absorbs the anger of the people and demobilizes the people. So the radical tendency of the tyrannical or anti-democratic precepts of the rulers is cut short. And by the time the military finish, people have to start all over again to be radical. Like in Nigeria, for instance, we have had a government that people are very critical of, right? The Tinubu regime. But people forget that they have fought Tinubu regime very well. Number one, he could not go to war in Niger because of popular rejection of war, right? The media, the religious leaders, the community leaders, the legislators, they said, no, we don't want war. That's why he is not at war. Number two, he has raised the fuel subsidy and people are fighting. Now, if a military coup occurs in Nigeria today, you jump up on the street and you forget about that temporarily. So I'm neither supporting nor condemning this thing, but I'm saying we should put it in context. we should put it in context.
Okay. Now, I threw this question to an analyst, and I'm wondering what your own thoughts will be. That is it time for us to perhaps accept the reality of military coup in Africa, and perhaps say that constitutionally the military has the powers to take over or set aside any government that is not doing right by the people? We've seen in the recent referendum in Mali, they made a provision where they have made that provision to say that the military can actually enforce law and order where it feels that there is a violation by the civil authority.
Yeah, the problem with the military is that they don't have there is a sense in which democracy is very good. Why? Because it involves consultation. It involves building consensus, coming to agreement. If there is disagreement between North and South, Christians and Muslims, young people and old people, women and men, they can reach consensus by arguing, by debating. That is very good, right? But you also don't have the instruments for always ensuring that this is what happens. So there is a gap. And as a result of this gap, elements like the military can utilize it and come to power. Okay? We have to be prepared for that. Maybe the best option is to ensure that we reduce the contradictions so that we close all gaps and stop military. Because we need the military for a different reason. A country like Nigeria needs a military that can knock any enemy in the head very, very, very well and enable us to sleep with pride. Do we have that now? Can you have that if they are also in government? They should always be practicing the art for which they enlisted. They should be practicing the art of war, how to deal with the enemy. They should concentrate on that. Go to military academy, upgrade their training, their equipment, But if they are in government, they can't do that.
How do we strengthen our institutions in a way that they can bridge some of the gaps that you've mentioned to ensure accountability and transparency and ensure that politicians or people who are voted into power, they play by the rules, and principles of democracy?
Well, my answer to that is that we have to have strong universities. That's the only way I see it. Because if you have strong universities, you will produce a critical mass. And that critical mass will make the difference. Why? They will make the difference because they are the ones who go into civil society. They are the ones who go into academia. They are the ones who go into the media. And the quality of their reasoning, the critical capability they have, is what will help the society to overcome, to challenge, to re-articulate, to discipline power. And unless you have that, power will always be arbitrary because power has its own temptations. Put an angel in the villa today, he will start misbehaving. So you have to have a capacity, a social capacity to discipline power, to say that, look, power, you cannot go beyond this. If you do that, society will react. So you need that. If you don't discipline power, power will always misbehave. So for you to discipline power, you need a critical mass. Not just educate 10,000 or 5,000. You need to educate a large percentage of the populace so that the middle class is always in a position to say no. If you don't have that, forget it.
In other words, you are pushing everything to education.
Yes, quality education, critical education. Why is it that leaders in Europe cannot misbehave? Even if they want to misbehave, they must do it underhand. You see them in the train, you see them in the bus, you see them going alone on their bicycle. Because if they show wealth, society will hang them. Right? One editor will write something that the prime minister will not sleep. And he's protected. But here, if you do that, you are in trouble. Because how many people come out, even when you are being dealt with, they say, yes, he doesn't hear words. is a very stubborn person. You will bear the blame as an individual, not the society. So you need a critical mass, and that's the operative word.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mala Ayuba.
You're watching Africa Update on Trust TV. Coming up shortly, we take a look at highlights from the Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi, Kenya. Join us again for more details. Thanks for staying. Now, a landmark African climate summit ended on Wednesday after leaders adopted a declaration highlighting the continent's potential as a green powerhouse, Kenyan President William Ruto said. This declaration will serve as a basis for Africa's common position in the global climate change process, the final version of the document seen by AFP has said. Now, the declaration calls for a new financing architecture that is responsive to Africa's needs, including debt restructuring and relief as frustration mounts over the high cost of financing on the continent. It also asks rich carbon polluters to honor long-standing climate pledges to poorer countries and urges world leaders to back a proposed carbon tax on fossil fuel trade, maritime transport and aviation. Now we speak with Dr. Dahiru Muhammad, Kano State Coordinator for Climatic Resilient in Semi-Arid Landscape, who was an attendee at the summit. All right, thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Dahiru Muhammad, on Africa Update to talk about the Africa Climate Summit in Nairobi, Kenya.
Thank you for having me.
All right. So perhaps if you can just quickly take us through some of the highlights of the summit, which I believe it's over now, but then what are some of the key highlights from that summit?
Well, good day to you all. I think the main highlights of this summit is that the Africa Climate Summit ended yesterday, which is a two-day event from 4th to 6th. And then there is the Africa Climate Week, which starts from the 6th to 8th. So that one is going to end tomorrow. And initially from the 2nd, there has been the Youth Assembly, which luckily enough, we have all participated. So this summit, the overall objectives of it is delivering climate positive growth and financial solution for Africa and the world at large. So it also hopes through this meeting to put in a unified front before the COP28 conference, which is going to take place on November 30th this year in United Arab Emirates. Additionally, the summit aims to impact promises, pledges, and outcomes such as the Nairobi Declaration, a roadmap for Africa's transition to green energy, and to address Africa's growing vulnerability to climate change and the costs associated with it on the continent.
Okay, so we understand that financing for climate adaptation took a central stage, at that summit. Talk to us about some of the declarations and some of the resolutions as regards, climate adaptation.
Yes, actually, it's even the main agenda that has been discussed, the issue of finance. But the goal is for Africa to have a unified front in going to the Sharm el-Sheikh, because that is where the issue of finance is going to be discussed, extensively, because that's where the donors are. But although during the summit there has been some concern, but as you know, Africa is not the one that is going to finance for this. That is going to pay for the climate finance. Is the developed countries that are going to pay. So the idea is for African countries to come up with a strong case and then to have a unified front, as I said earlier, so that they can be able to have a meaningful discussion, so that the issue of this climate finance will be made a history, because we have been discussing about this right from the Paris summit up to this year. So as you know, this is the first climate conference in Africa, and then the African countries have all agreed on a uniform goal in order to go and confront the developed countries in seeing how to assess for the funding.
Okay, the president of Kenya, William Ruto, has been very particular and vocal about a global carbon tax regime that should be initiated and agreed upon by countries, so that the idea of, the existing financial institutions and, other Western countries being the ones to, at their own whims and caprices, decide whether or not to fund climate change adaptation on the continent should be looked into and reviewed. So what's the stand as regards that?
What is what, sorry?
What's the stand as regards the, some of the things that President William Ruto has advocated in times past about, the global financial architecture as regards climate change?
Well, honestly, he has made a very strong case, which I believe all of the countries have agreed with him. He has talked about how Africa has been able to contribute to this carbon offset and the need for the developed countries to pay for that service Africa has been offering. He has cited Kenya as an example of places, offsetting carbon. But what he even stressed more on is, when we're talking about these global carbon emissions, Africa is contributing to less than 4% of it. But in terms of the climate crisis, we are at the receiving end of it. So what President Ruto has emphasized on, which he spoke on behalf of all the African countries, is for the developed countries to see the contribution that Africa has been offering. We have all these forests that has been contributing so much in absorbing carbon that we have not produced.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Dahiru Muhammad, for joining us on Africa Update and sharing some of the takeaways from the Africa Climate Summit. We appreciate that.
Thank you so much, Ayuba, for having me. Thank you.
Well, that's our show for today. In case you've missed, you can always watch more on our social media platforms and also on our YouTube live stream. I am Ayuba Ilya. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.